All right, what's cracking, y'all? So we're going to be deep diving into Tesamorelin today, which is a GHRH growth hormone releasing hormone, which ties to your anterior pituitary gland. It attaches itself to somatropin cells, which make up about 30 to 40% of the cells from the anterior pituitary gland, which help to attach to receptors to stimulate growth hormone. So essentially, that's what tesamorelin is. It's a one mechanism of action peptide. That's its main action, is to help stimulate growth hormone. So through that, obviously, growth hormone is converted to IGF-1 in the liver, which IGF-1 is going to be the main thing responsible for a lot of the benefits that you see with it. And we're going to be diving into a study here that is pretty much comparing studies of patients, if you want to call them that, with HIV, and then those, basically all the patients have a form of HIV, but basically one group is being treated through tesamorelin and the other group is not, and they're breaking down what they see from it. So the goal of this study here is that they're trying to measure the effects of tesamorelin as well on muscle quality, measured in density, and then quantity, so area. It's basically like the cross-sectional fibers of muscle, how much they increase or decrease. And they'll be looking at muscle quality. They base that kind of off of how much fat is actually found in the muscle cells. So we're going to be diving into this here. Just so you know, so participants, people living with HIV with abdominal obesity, in the study they're also going to be mainly trying to see over the course of 26 weeks how much visceral adipose tissue is reduced from use of tesamorelin, which visceral adipose tissue is basically the more like deep inside fat that surrounds more so like your organs, which is usually the harder fat to get rid of. And they measure this, and basically anyone that had we'll call it VAT, visceral adipose tissue decrease of more than or equal to 8%, which they'll actually even see some patients in here that had up to 16% of a reduction, which is very valid. So the measurements here, the differences between muscle area and density before up to 26 weeks of tesamorelin or placebo treatment were compared, and linear regression models were adjusted from baseline and treatment arm. Results, tesamorelin responders, and then placebo. So they had 193 people, basically patients taking tesamorelin, and then 148 of them that did not. And then the biggest drawback with this study is that most of the participants in this study were white males, like 87% of them were male, and then 83% of that 87% were white males. So this study definitely lacks a little bit of ethnic diversity, but it's still better than nothing. So among those with clinically significant decrease in visceral adipose tissue on treatment, tesamorelin was effective in increasing skeletal muscle area and density. Wasn't really that effective in increasing muscle area. We'll kind of get into that, but it was definitely more effective at increasing the muscle density. So long-term effectiveness of tesamorelin among people with and without HIV and the impact of the changes should be studying their daily life, should be further studied. So obviously, like any peptide, we don't really have like a ton of research on, so it'll kind of state that multiple times. So due to the success of antiretroviral therapy, which is pretty much just the therapy of them taking a pill form medication to help them suppress the side effects of HIV, is saying, so basically saying, due to the success of that antiretroviral therapy, we'll call it ART therapy, persons living with human immunodeficiency virus infection, which if we know anything about HIV, it pretty much destroys your immune system and can lead to susceptibility of diseases, infections, etc., that could possibly lead to death. So not something you want to do. But it's saying because of these people taking these ART therapies, ART virus infection, people are living longer, and they're experiencing conditions commonly associated with aging, like cardiovascular disease, neuroprotective dysfunction, physical function impairments, falls, and other multiple factors that contribute to the development of these disease processes. An accumulation of visceral adipose tissue, VAT, may play a central role. VAT accumulation is associated with HIV, ART therapy, and diet and physical activity. It may contribute to the low-level chronic inflammatory state persistent in HIV infection despite virologic suppression. Indeed, several studies have shown strong associations between VAT and central adiposity and cardiovascular disease, etc., etc. VAT tends to accumulate with increasing age. The deposition of this ectopic adipose tissue in organs, including the liver, epicardium, and skeletal muscle, has been associated with organ-specific disease development, including liver steatosis and fibrosis. So fibrosis is basically saying like when inflammation essentially kind of gets too high, it can kind of start to harden in and around organs, arteries, etc., and that can cause issues you don't want to deal with. And then myocardial infarction, physical function and limitations, blah, 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 blah. So basically just saying with increasing age, you start to accumulate more visceral adipose tissue, which leads to these issues that we could be seeing within organs, specifically hepatic issues like in the liver. So in randomized controlled double-blind studies, tesamorelin decreased VAT by approximately 15% compared to placebo. In a separate study, tesamorelin reduced hepatic fat by a relative 40%. That is wild. Wild. Think about it. This little one peptide in comparison to just your liver helped to reduce liver fat by almost 40%. That is crazy. Among people living with HIV or PLWH with abdominal fat accumulation compared to a 27% increase into the placebo arm. So the placebo actually had an increase instead of a 40% decrease comparison to the tesamorelin arm, which if I say arm, that's pretty much just saying to the group of people that had the tesamorelin use. So scientists pretty much just said that they hypothesized that the use of tesamorelin would increase skeletal muscle density, less fat within the muscle tissue, aka better muscle quality too, and skeletal muscle area, supportive of an overall improvement in muscle quality compared to placebo. This analysis is a secondary exploratory analysis of two previously completed and randomized 2-to-1 clinical trials of tesamorelin versus placebo among people living with HIV with abdominal adiposity. So pretty much they're just saying that they're getting this data comparing studies that were already done. A minimum of 8% of VAT change was considered clinically relevant. So, and then PLWH, people living with HIV, with equal to or greater than 8% of VAT reduction were thus deemed responders. So basically anyone that had less than an 8% reduction in VAT was not considered to have a significant response to tesamorelin. Based on the initial studies, approximately 70% of the people living with HIV had central adiposity that received tesamorelin met that responding criteria. So of the 70% of people that were taking the tesamorelin had that 8% or more visceral adipose tissue reduction, which is very, very significant. So CT scans were the main use of measurement of that VAT in this study. They were obtained as part of the initial studies with methods described, like in other studies here, for this exploratory analysis, truncal muscle density. So that basically within this CT scan, they're measuring the muscle within four different muscle groups within the trunk or your like abdominals. So the main muscle groups they were basically trying to test was the rectus abdominis, which is pretty much going from that pubic bone all the way up into like the sternum, and then to the anterior lateral abdominal muscle walls, external and internal oblique and transverse abdominis, the PSOAS major, which is kind of more so like in the groin, almost going up into your lumbar spine, and then the paraspinal muscles, erector spinae and transverse spinalis. So those are the main muscle groups that they're like specifically targeting. So that's kind of another drawback of this study as well, is that this study is specifically, if I can speak, specifically designed to measure the reduction of visceral fat in the abdominal muscles. So that's where like clinical data is kind of lacking right now, is can this, like this peptide tesamorelin is kind of known as the peptide for helping to reduce visceral fat. But we don't really know if maybe something like CJC 1295 paired with ipamorelin could do just the exact same thing, which they basically can, but the studies just aren't out there for specifically reducing visceral fat. So it's like, take tesamorelin, it's the peptide for reducing visceral fat, but it's not like we know that specifically. We just haven't tested that specifically. Whereas CJC 1295 and ipamorelin, they've been specifically tested for maybe like sleep or performance or, things like that. So we just need more data to really actually compare and contrast of like, is this peptide really that much better than this stack of peptides? You know what I mean? So change in muscle density and lean muscle density, muscle area, and lean muscle area for each muscle group between 0 and 26 weeks were compared within treatment arms using paired tests. We then singularly tested the addition of change in VAT and change in IGF-1 to adjust for multiple analysis. A p-value of less than 0.005 was considered statistically significant. And then I'm just going to scroll down here. I'm pretty much just trying to go over the stuff that I think like actually matters and highlighted here. I don't want to just kind of like read this thing off verbatim to you. I just kind of want to give you the stuff raw from these studies that I think actually kind of matters. You guys can actually like apply in your decision-making process of what it really is and what the data clinical analysis really is that you can help to apply to your knowledge. And you're not trying to just listen to someone on YouTube about, someone on YouTube claiming that they're a doctor trying to give you information. I'm just kind of reading through these studies and breaking down what these studies say and trying to apply it to you in a way also as a bodybuilder and bodybuilding coach. So compared to placebo, 26 weeks of tesamorelin was associated with significantly greater increase of total muscle density, so less fat in the muscle, within all 4 truncal muscle groups. And this is, basically, again, just saying that within that 26 weeks of tesamorelin use, it was mainly found that it just helped with overall muscle density, less fat in the muscle, which again reduced visceral adipose tissue. So whether these increases in skeletal muscle density and area have clinically meaningful impacts in skeletal muscle function cannot be determined through this analysis, but our initial exploratory findings support that IGF-1 effects on skeletal muscle prompt further investigation and highlight several points of discussion. So they're basically just saying like they can't 100% say that the initial findings support that IGF-1 effects on the muscle tissue are like strictly just from the actual like IGF-1 or from just taking tesamorelin, you know what I mean? So several studies have shown associations between less thigh musculature with poor lower limb performance and may contribute to mobility impairment. Goodpaster et al. Observed that trunk muscle density, our primary outcome, was strongly correlated with thigh density. So kind of an interesting, just random statistic, not really too much applied to people in their 20s, like as bodybuilders. This is more so talking for like elderly people in their 70s and 80s, like down here. We're saying several studies have shown that people with basically less thigh musculature, lower limb performance, can contribute to that mobility impairment, which, obviously, like you can't walk as much. You're probably going to maybe fall. Maybe these people are using like wheelchairs, etc. But then this other Goodpaster et al. Observed that the trunk or abdomen muscle density was actually the primary outcome, strongly correlated with thigh density. So basically, the stronger abdomen you have, which correlated to the better density in the abdomen that you have, less fat in the abdomen that you have, almost correlates directly with better leg thigh strength. And also, I'm not sure if it says in here, but also grip strength, which is one of the hallmarks of health, is how well your grip strength is. So in our analysis, changes in muscle density within the Tesamorelin arm did not correlate with IGF-1 concentration. These findings were further corroborated in the multivariate analysis, as corroborated pretty much just meaning further backed up in the multivariate analyses, where changes in the muscle density remain significant across many muscle groups even after adjusting for change in IGF-1. So basically saying that in this study, even after factoring in the increase of IGF-1, the muscle density of like myostatosis is the process of that. Myostatosis is the process of basically getting rid of the fat within the muscle, still remains significant even with the IGF-1 increase aside. So it's saying it's still significant. In contrast of the muscle density findings, muscle area and lean muscle area were independent of VAT, but not IGF-1 changes. Although our findings suggest that the tesamorelin effect on muscle area may be more related to the IGF-1 effects rather than the VAT reduction. Our results are limited by the inclusion of VAT responders only. So pretty much saying that when they accounted for the IGF-1 conversion increase from tesamorelin, that the muscle area increase was not as significant once they factored in the IGF-1 effects. In summary, among people living with HIV with excess abdominal fat who had clinical response to tesamorelin, trunk muscle density and lean muscle area increased over 26 weeks. Changes in muscle density were largely independent of changes in IGF-1 and attenuated by changes in VAT, while changes in muscle area were independent of VAT changes and attenuated, in part by changes in IGF-1. The clinical relevance of these changes on measures of muscle strength and function in tesamorelin recipients remained to be established. So again, kind of just saying that over the 26 weeks, the trunk muscle density and lean muscle area both increased over the 26 weeks. And the muscle density was largely significant increase aside from the IGF-1 increase, basically also saying kind of again that they were significant in spite of the IGF-1. The clinical relevance of these changes on measures of muscle strength and function of tesamorelin yet to be established. So that's basically just saying that the increase in the muscle density and area, the effects of it applied in an actual maybe like resistance training performance hasn't really been studied yet. So we don't really know how significant that increase in muscle density and area plays into actual performance. So needs more study there. So yeah, that's kind of just like a breakdown of this study here of tesamorelin. All right, so now that we've gone through that study, we can kind of go through how do we apply this information to us as bodybuilders. So tesamorelin does have a very short half-life of about 30 to 60 minutes. You're going to want to inject this at a point before bed so you can best line it up with your body's natural secretion of growth hormone. You want to do this on a relatively empty stomach as much as possible because we want that hormone signaling of ghrelin already going on to help maximize that release of growth hormone, because that is a big precursor in that release from the pituitary gland. So making sure that you inject this before bed is important on an empty stomach as much as possible. If we're going for like dosage, I'd say a good place to start, again, this is just advice, is like 1 to 2 milligrams daily. Always start at the lowest dose and you can always titrate up. But outside of that, we can always pair this with other peptides as well, like ipamorelin, retatrutide, semaglutide. If we're going for fat loss, maybe some CJC 1295 or GRP2 or 6 in the off season to help optimize performance and like metabolic function, along with a GRP6 for appetite, or maybe some AOD 9604 for some body recomposition in a reverse phase after prep, or maybe in that health phase going into your next off season. So this is where I would maybe start if you're pondering tesamorelin. But like I said, for most people, for the price point you're going to have to get this at, it would make more sense to just do a direct exogenous source of growth hormone. or just doing some CJC 1295 with some ipamorelin instead of doing Tesamorelin. Or you can get it at a cheaper price point, or you can just get a better quality one of growth hormone. So this is where I would start as bodybuilders. You know, we can really maximize the inflammation kind of control in the off season whenever food intake is high, PED use is high, or, you know, keeping our waist tight by reducing some of that sub-Q and visceral fat and keeping our organs healthy. That's very, very important. And then just maximizing sleep, etc. Metabolic function will improve. You know, we can really use this in almost any season. It's just about what makes the most sense for you. So, hope you found this video helpful. If you want to let me know in the comments what maybe peptide PED you would like me to review in the future. I don't want to make this like the main thing I do. I'm just trying to do this to spread information, that we guys are getting information from actual articles, sources, studies from an actual active bodybuilder and bodybuilding coach that you can use to apply to your own life as maybe other bodybuilders or just Gen Pop or athletes in general, etc. So let me know if you found these videos helpful, subscribe, and I'll see you later. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.